There were precisely 11 kinds of silence in the imperial court of Vaelthar, and Caius Morrow had been subjected to all of them in the span of a single afternoon. He'd catalogued them the way a man catalogues the stages of a slow disaster, with the detached precision of someone who has accepted that the situation cannot get worse and is simply waiting to be proven wrong. There was the silence of dismissal, which had greeted him at the entrance when the ceremonial herald had announced Earth's delegation and then immediately moved on, as if the words had been a minor clerical error. There was the silence of condescension, deployed by the Vaelthari nobles who floated past him on their anti-gravity platforms, their 6 eyes arranged in a crown around their elongated skulls, each eye independently capable of expressing contempt. There was the silence of institutional invisibility, which was perhaps the cruelest, because it didn't even bother being hostile. It simply treated him as furniture. Decorative, perhaps, certainly not interactive. Caius was 31 years old. He had a doctorate in xenolinguistics, a secondary degree in comparative civilizational philosophy, and had spent 4 years learning to read Vaelthari emotional sub-frequencies from a second-hand data pad that was missing 2 translation modules. He spoke 7 languages, including 2 that had no human mouth sounds, which he reproduced using a small vibration collar around his throat that his colleagues back home had affectionately nicknamed the embarrassment box. He had prepared for this posting the way other people prepared for warfare, with exhaustion and sacrifice and a quiet, stubborn hope that refused to die, even when common sense suggested it should. None of this had mattered in the slightest. The imperial court of Vaelthar occupied the peak of a mountain that had been hollowed out, inverted, and suspended above a dead ocean by technology so old that its original creators had been extinct for longer than humanity had been walking upright. The inside of the mountain was the palace, ceiling of rock, floor of open sky, the ocean visible 4 kilometers below through the transparent walkways that connected chambers like threads in a vast, impossible web. Caius had made the mistake of looking down once. He hadn't looked down again. He had a theory that whoever built this place had specifically designed it to make visitors feel small, and he had to admit it was working. The summit was called the Convocation of 12 Weights, 12 species, each representing a different arm of the Vaelthari-led coalition, gathered every standard decade to reaffirm alliances, redistribute trade agreements, and perform the elaborate ritual of pretending that everyone was equal, while making absolutely certain that everyone understood they were not. Earth had been granted observer status 18 months ago, which the diplomatic briefing had described as a significant step forward, and which Caius had come to understand meant, you may watch but you may not speak unless spoken to, and no one intends to speak to you. He stood near a pillar of crystallized atmospheric gas, the Vaelthari equivalent of a decorative plant, and watched the delegations move around each other with the choreographed precision of long practice. The Solvith, with their bodies like living mercury, pooled and reformed as they conversed, their shapes shifting to express emotions their faces couldn't contain. The Dravani ambassadors, insectoid and ancient, communicated in overlapping pheromone clouds that Caius's translation equipment rendered as elaborately polite threats. The Mirathi delegation, beings of compressed starlight encased in mobile crystalline shells, simply stood in the center of every room they entered and let others come to them, which they always did. Caius had 3 observation notebooks. 2 were full. He was halfway through the 3rd. The food was technically edible. He'd confirmed this with a portable bioscan before consuming anything, a habit that had earned him several sideways looks, but had also saved him from accidentally ingesting something that metabolized into a mild neurotoxin in human digestive systems. The Vaelthari caterers had apparently been briefed on human nutritional requirements and had responded by producing a tray of perfectly nutritious, completely flavorless cubes that sat in his stomach with the enthusiasm of wet concrete. He ate them methodically, standing by his pillar, watching a Solvith diplomat reshape itself into a form that apparently conveyed deep political philosophy, and wondered if his mother had been right about the accounting career. His translation collar buzzed against his throat, nearby conversation automatically captured. He glanced down at the readout on his wrist display and saw that 2 Veilthari court attendants, young ones by the silver tinting of their orbital eyes, were discussing him with the casual confidence of people who assumed he couldn't understand them. The translation was imperfect. It always was. The collar couldn't catch emotional sub-frequencies without the missing modules, but the broad meaning was clear enough. They were debating whether Earth humans were biologically capable of embarrassment, and if so, whether this one had yet noticed how thoroughly he was being ignored. Caius typed a note into his 3rd notebook. Day 4, still invisible. Begin questioning whether observer status was granted in good faith or as elaborate cosmic joke. Lean toward cosmic joke. He wasn't wrong to lean that way. The announcement came without preamble. No ceremonial herald this time, just a shift in the room's atmospheric pressure that Caius felt in his eardrums before he understood what it meant. Every delegate in the chamber stopped moving. The Solvith froze mid-reshape. The pheromone clouds of the Dravani dissipated in an instant, which his translation equipment flagged as the olfactory equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Empress Vaelthis had entered the convocation hall. Caius had read the briefings. He had studied the photographs, the holographic recordings, the 17 academic papers written about her in the past century. None of it had prepared him for the reality of her presence, which moved through the room not like a person, but like a change in weather. She was tall by Veilthari standards, which made her extraordinary by any standard. Her 6 eyes arranged in their crown configuration, but moving with an unsettling coordination that suggested unified focus rather than independent perception. Her robes were the deep black of space between galaxies, not fabric, but suspended particulate matter held in coherent form by fields Caius didn't have the physics vocabulary to describe. She moved like someone who had never once considered the possibility of an obstacle, because nothing had ever dared to be one. She was surveying the room with the careful attention of someone taking inventory, and then her 6 eyes found Caius Morrow, standing by his decorative pillar with his observation notebook and his flavorless cubes, and she stopped. The silence that followed was the 12th kind, the kind he hadn't catalogued yet because he hadn't known it existed. She crossed the room toward him, and every eye in the convocation hall followed. Caius had a rule about powerful people walking toward him with intent. The rule was simple. Assume you've done something wrong, identify what it was, and prepare an apology that sounds confident enough to be mistaken for dignity. The problem was that he couldn't identify anything he'd done wrong in the last 30 seconds, which either meant he was innocent or that the offense was so severe he'd committed it without noticing. Both possibilities felt equally likely given his track record at this summit. He straightened his back. This was not bravery. This was the posture of a man who had decided that if he was going to be publicly humiliated in front of 12 alien delegations, he was at least going to have good spine alignment while it happened. His translation collar hummed against his throat. His wrist display flickered with real-time readouts. His 3rd observation notebook was still open in his hand, which he slowly closed with the careful casualness of someone trying not to look like they'd been taking notes on everyone in the room for 4 consecutive days. Empress Vaelthis stopped 3 paces from him. Up close, her 6 eyes were more unsettling than the photographs had suggested, not because they were alien, but because they were focused. All 6 of them, on him, simultaneously. He had the distinct sensation of being read the way one reads a document, systematically, looking for inconsistencies. Her voice, when she spoke, carried harmonics that his collar caught but couldn't fully translate. The emotional sub-frequency beneath her words registered as something between amusement and deliberate provocation. The words themselves were clean enough. "You are the Earth representative." It wasn't a question. Caius answered anyway because silence felt worse. "Caius Morrow, yes. Xenolinguistics and civilizational philosophy. Observer delegation." He paused. "Your Eminence." He'd almost forgotten the honorific. The briefing had been very clear about the honorific. Her orbital eyes shifted in a pattern his training identified as the Veilthari equivalent of raised eyebrows. "I have been told," she said, and the harmonics beneath her words sharpened into something that the other delegates were clearly already tracking, because he heard the Solvith behind him reform into a shape that his peripheral awareness registered as collective attention. That your species has been attending this convocation for 4 days and has contributed precisely nothing to any discussion of substance. Around the room, the quality of silence changed. It became participatory. Caius recognized the dynamic. He'd seen it in graduate seminars when a professor had decided to make an example of someone. The audience wasn't watching out of concern. They were watching to see how badly it went. He considered his options with the speed of a man who had always done his best thinking under pressure, which was fortunate because pressure was the only environment this posting had offered him. He could be diplomatic, offer some careful non-answer about Earth's observer status and the importance of listening before speaking. He could be apologetic, frame Earth's silence as respectful deference to more established voices. He could be invisible, which he'd already been doing for 4 days with great success. Instead, he heard himself say, "That's accurate," though I'd push back slightly on the word nothing. The harmonics in the room shifted. The Dravani pheromone clouds reformed in what his equipment translated as sharp interest. The Empress's 6 eyes didn't move, but something behind them did. A recalibration. "Push back," she repeated, as if testing the phrase for structural integrity. "You would push back. On an accurate statement." "On the framing," Caius said. His translation collar was working hard. He could feel it vibrating against his throat in the double pulse pattern that meant it was processing complex emotional undertones and wasn't sure it was getting them right. Earth's delegation hasn't contributed to any discussion of substance because we haven't been included in any discussion of substance. We've been present. There's a difference. The Empress studied him. He studied her back, which was either brave or catastrophically unaware of social hierarchies. He was genuinely uncertain which. "You are observing," she said. "That is the designation given to your species." "We are," Caius agreed. "I filled 3 notebooks in 4 days. I could tell you the specific pheromone sequence the Dravani ambassador deploys when he disagrees with something but doesn't want to say so directly. I could tell you that the Mirathi delegation has had the same internal disagreement 6 times since the convocation opened. Always about the same agenda point, always resolved by the same compromise, which suggests there's a structural tension in their coalition that hasn't been formally acknowledged. I could tell you that the Veilthari court attendants on the Eastern Corridor change the atmospheric composition of that hallway by a measurable degree every time the Solvith delegation passes through it, which is either a calibration error in the environmental systems or a deliberate signal, and I have a theory about which one it is. He paused. We haven't been contributing to discussions, but we haven't been doing nothing. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own weather event. Empress Veilthis tilted her head. The gesture wasn't in his briefing materials. He added it to his mental catalogue under unknown, possibly significant. "You can read Dravani pheromone sequences," she said. "Imperfectly. My translation equipment is missing 2 modules. I've been compensating with pattern recognition and context." "Show me." Caius blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The Dravani ambassador. He is standing near the far pillar." She didn't look in that direction. She didn't need to. "Tell me what he is feeling right now." Caius looked. His equipment was already running. The pheromone cloud around Ambassador Drevansi was complex, layered, which usually meant emotional overlap. He passed it the way he'd taught himself, working from the base notes out, cross-referencing with context. The ambassador was watching this conversation. His cloud had the sharp, high-frequency signature that Caius had come to associate with intense focus. Underneath it was something slower, something that didn't have a clean translation but that he'd seen twice before. Once when a trade agreement had been unexpectedly altered in the Dravani's favor. Once when a diplomatic slight had been quietly filed away for future reference. "He's paying very close attention," Caius said carefully. "And he's filing this moment somewhere. Whether that's because it's useful to him or because it concerns him, I can't say for certain. The base emotional signature is the same for both." The Empress was quiet. Then she said something that his collar translated with a confidence rating of 62%, which meant it was probably in the right direction but possibly missing nuance. What it rendered was interesting. What the emotional sub-frequency beneath it suggested, with the caveat that he was working without two translation modules and possibly reading too much into harmonics, was something closer to, "I did not expect that." She looked at him for another long moment, and Caius had the strange, disorienting sensation of being genuinely seen for the first time in 4 days. Not assessed, not catalogued, not dismissed. Seen. "You have been watching us," the Empress said. "All of us." "It's what observers do," Caius said. "Your Eminence." She made a sound that might have been the Veilthari equivalent of a short laugh. It might have been something else entirely. His collar gave it a confidence rating of 41%, which meant he was essentially guessing. "Come," she said and turned. Caius stood very still for exactly 1 second, confirming that she meant him, that this was happening, that the Empress of Veilthar had just told him to follow her through the Convocation Hall in front of every delegation present. His wrist display showed his own biometrics spiking in a way that his bioscan would probably flag as mild cardiovascular concern. He followed. Behind him he heard the Solvith reshape again. He didn't look back to see what form they'd taken, but his translation equipment caught a fragment of whispered Drivani pheromone, a short burst, quickly suppressed. His equipment rendered it simply as unexpected. Caius thought that was probably the understatement of the decade. The chamber she led him to was not on any map he'd been given. This was the first thing he noted, with the automatic reflex of someone who had learned to treat unexpected information as data rather than panic. His summit briefing had included detailed schematics of the Imperial Court, color-coded by access level and annotated with warnings about which corridors required which clearances. The chamber at the end of this particular corridor, accessible through a door that appeared to be made of solidified sound, he could feel it vibrating faintly against his palm as it opened, had not appeared anywhere in those schematics. Either the maps were incomplete, which was possible, or this room was deliberately omitted, which was more interesting. He noted this in his third notebook while walking, which earned him a glance from the Empress. She didn't comment. He didn't stop writing. The chamber was smaller than he'd expected. After the vast theatrical excess of the Convocation Hall, this room felt almost modest, roughly circular, its walls made of the same hollow mountain rock as the palace exterior, undecorated except for a series of markings carved directly into the stone at eye level. The markings ran the full circumference of the room. Caius recognized the script immediately and felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't quite excitement and wasn't quite dread, but lived in the neighborhood of both. It was Old Veilthari. Not the contemporary script, the archaic form, predating the current empire by approximately 4,000 years. He had 3 reference texts on Old Veilthari, all incomplete, all contradictory on at least a dozen key symbols. He had never expected to see it outside an academic archive. He was already moving toward the nearest section of wall before he fully realized he'd done it. "You recognize the script," the Empress said behind him. Statement, not question. She was developing a habit of those. "Old Veilthari," Caius said, his eyes moving along the carved symbols with the focused hunger of someone who had spent years studying a language they'd never expected to encounter in person. 4th millennium pre-imperial, if I'm reading the symbol evolution correctly, maybe earlier. He stopped at a section where the carving style shifted subtly, the strokes slightly deeper, the spacing different. This section was added later. Different hand, different period, maybe several hundred years after the original inscription. He paused, aware that he'd just walked away from the Empress of Veilthar to examine a wall without asking permission, which was probably not standard diplomatic protocol. He turned back. "I apologize, I should have asked before. What does it say?" She was watching him with that same six-eyed focus, but something in the quality of it had shifted. Less inventory, more something he didn't have a word for yet. Caius turned back to the wall. His collar was useless here. It was built for spoken language, not written ancient script. He was working from memory and the incomplete, contradictory reference texts he'd spent 3 years studying. He moved slowly along the inscription, translating in his head, cross-referencing, flagging the symbols he wasn't certain about. The Empress didn't rush him. The room was quiet except for the faint subsonic vibration of the door behind them and the soft hum of his wrist display. "It's a record," he said finally, "or part of one. This section," he indicated the original inscription, "is describing something that was lost, not destroyed, lost. There's a distinction in Old Veilthari between those two concepts that doesn't translate cleanly. Destruction is permanent but external. Loss implies the thing still exists somewhere, just no longer accessible." He moved to the later edition. "This part is a response to the first inscription, written much later, as I said. Someone came back to this room and added to what was already here." He worked through it symbol by symbol, flagging 3 he couldn't fully resolve. "It says something like, and I want to be clear that I'm uncertain about 2 of these symbols, so this is an approximation. It says something like, we have been searching in the wrong direction. The answer was never in our expansion. It was in what we failed to carry with us." He turned around. Empress Veilthis was very still. All 6 of her eyes were focused on him, with an intensity that his physiological training suggested should have felt threatening. It didn't. It felt strangely like being in the planetarium back home. The particular quality of attention that came from witnessing something you hadn't known you were looking for. "No one has translated that inscription in 300 years, she said. Her voice was steady. The harmonics beneath it were not. His collar caught them imperfectly, confidence rating 58%. But even at 58%, the emotional signal was strong enough to register clearly, something between grief and recognition. Our own scholars have attempted it. They concluded the archaic form was too degraded to produce reliable meaning. It's not degraded, Caius said carefully. It's just old. The reference texts that most contemporary scholars use for Old Veilthari were compiled after several translation reforms that introduced systematic errors in how certain root symbols are interpreted. If you're working from those texts, you'd hit walls that look like degradation, but are actually just accumulated mistranslation. He paused. "I found a pre-reform text in an academic archive on Earth. Third-hand copy of a copy of a copy, some sections missing, but the foundational symbol set is intact. It changes how a significant portion of Old Veilthari reads." The Empress crossed the room toward the wall. She stood beside him, looking at the inscription he'd just translated. Up close he could see details he'd missed from across the room, the careful depth of each carved symbol, the evidence of hands that had worked slowly, deliberately, as if understanding that what they were recording mattered more than how long it took. "You found this text on Earth," she said. "In a private archive. A xenolinguistics professor who'd spent 40 years collecting pre-reform documents from species across the coalition. She died before she could publish her work. Her family was going to discard the collection." He paused. "I drove 14 hours to buy it from them for roughly the cost of a used vehicle that had already seen better days." Something moved across the Empress's face, a micro-expression his training couldn't fully categorize. "Why?" she asked. It was such a simple question that it caught him off guard. Not how or what does it mean or any of the logistical follow-ups he'd expected. Just why. "Because it mattered," Caius said. "Because someone spent 40 years collecting it, and that meant something, even if no one else was paying attention. Because languages don't stop being important just because the people who speak them are gone, or because no one currently considers them relevant." He looked at the inscription. "Because things that are lost aren't always gone. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone to look in the right direction." The Empress was quiet for a long time, long enough that Caius became aware again of the subsonic hum of the door, the distant sounds of the convocation carrying faintly through the mountain rock, the soft rhythm of his own breathing. "The scholars who told me that inscription was unreadable," she said finally, "presented their conclusions with great confidence." "Confidence and accuracy aren't the same thing," Caius said. "Your Eminence." She turned to look at him, and this time the expression on her face was clear enough that he didn't need a confidence rating to read it. She was not angry. She was not dismissive. She was, as far as he could tell, genuinely uncertain, which he suspected was not a state she occupied frequently. "You are not what I was told to expect," she said. "Earth rarely is," Caius said. "We've been getting that a lot lately." Her 6 eyes held something he hadn't seen in them before. He opened his 3rd notebook and added a new entry. 12th kind of silence has a follow-up. The silence of someone reconsidering something they thought was already decided. He underlined it twice. They returned to the convocation hall through a different corridor than the one they'd left by. Caius noticed this but didn't comment on it. He was beginning to understand that the Empress made very few accidental choices, and that the route back was probably as deliberate as the route there had been. He walked beside her, which was itself a thing that hadn't happened before. Not beside, not trailing at the respectful 2-pace distance that everyone else maintained, but genuinely beside, close enough that he could hear the faint coherence hum of the particulate matter composing her robes. His wrist display was logging everything. His translation collar was working overtime. His 3rd notebook had 4 new pages of observations, and he hadn't slowed down enough to write anything for the last 10 minutes, which meant he was going to have to reconstruct from memory later, which he was already doing preemptively. The corridor opened back into the convocation hall, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate and physical. Not just the change in room size, though the hall's vast sky floor expanse was a significant sensory contrast to the carved stone chamber. It was the attention. The hall had been a place of careful performances before he'd left. Now it was something different. Every delegation had rearranged itself, subtly the way chess pieces moved when a new piece was introduced to the board, and every rearrangement was oriented, with varying degrees of indirectness, toward them. Caius counted the angles of attention the way he'd counted the types of silence. It was a coping mechanism he'd developed in graduate school and refined over 4 days of being comprehensively ignored, and it was serving him well now in the inverted situation. The Solvith had pooled themselves near the central walkway in a configuration his training suggested was attentive neutrality, waiting to see before committing to a position. The Drevani ambassador had moved closer to the hall's center, which was a significant gesture for a species that communicated largely through environmental chemistry, because it meant his pheromone clouds would now reach a wider radius. The Mirathi delegation had done something he hadn't seen them do once in 4 days. They'd turned to face the entrance instead of standing as passive centers of gravity, waiting for others to orbit them. Earth's observer status had apparently become considerably more interesting in the 40 minutes he'd been absent. Ambassador Reyes found him within 30 seconds of his return. She was Earth's senior diplomatic representative, 15 years his senior in the Corps, and she had the particular expression of someone who was maintaining professionalism through the kind of determined effort that would probably require extensive rest afterward. She appeared at his elbow with the precision of someone who had been tracking his position from across the room and had timed her approach to the second. "Morrow," she said, at a volume calibrated precisely for his ears and no others. "I need you to explain to me in small words what just happened." "The Empress asked to see the inscription chamber," Caius said. "I translated the old Veilthari inscription on the inner wall. We had a conversation." Ambassador Reyes looked at him steadily. "The inscription chamber that our briefing materials don't mention?" "Yes. That you translated, in old Veilthari, which you taught yourself from a pre-reform reference text." "Partially taught myself. There are still symbols I'm uncertain about. I flagged the uncertain ones when I was translating." She was quiet for a moment, that felt weighted with several things she'd decided not to say. Then, "The Drevani ambassador just requested a meeting with our delegation. The Mirathi have sent a preliminary inquiry about Earth's xenolinguistic research programs. 3 separate Veilthari court officials have asked my staff for your academic credentials." Another pause. "You've been here 4 days and I haven't been able to get anyone to learn my name." "To be fair," Caius said, "you haven't been accidentally summoned by the Empress." "Neither have you, I assume?" "No," he admitted. "That part was not accidental on her side. I'm still working out what it was on my side." Ambassador Reyes studied him with the careful attention of a diplomat who had spent 15 years learning to read situations before the situations read her. "Be careful, Caius," she said quietly and genuinely. Unexpected visibility in a court like this isn't always a gift. He knew she was right. He also knew that the alternative, the careful, invisible corner existence of the last 4 days, had been its own kind of slow diminishment, the type that compounded interest. He nodded, and she moved away, and he was left standing in the center of the hall with the weight of several hundred eyes pretending not to watch him. The Empress had taken her position at the elevated platform near the hall's far end, where the convocation's formal proceedings were conducted. Around her, court officials moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the afternoon session. She did not look in his direction. He did not look in hers. And yet he was aware of her presence in the room the way you were aware of a change in atmospheric pressure, not visible, but felt. The afternoon session began with a trade dispute between the Solveth and a minor coalition species called the Tharvan, whose delegation consisted of a single representative who communicated through bioluminescent patterns on her outer membrane. Caius had spent 2 days observing the Tharvan representative and had concluded that she was either the most patient being in the convocation or the most exhausted one, and wasn't entirely sure those were different things. The dispute concerned transit rights through a corridor that Caius's spatial mapping suggested was genuinely ambiguous in terms of jurisdiction, the kind of ambiguity that persisted not because the answer was unclear, but because neither party wanted to be the first to propose the solution, since proposing it would implicitly acknowledge they'd always known it. He watched. He took notes, his choler translated in fragments, missing the emotional undertones, assembling approximate meaning from incomplete signals. At some point, a Veilthari court attendant appeared at his side and placed a chair beside the observer section's standing area, a small thing, a piece of furniture technically meaningless. He sat in it anyway and felt the shift it represented without needing to analyze it further. The session continued for 3 hours. In the second hour, the Empress spoke. She addressed the trade dispute between the Solveth and the Tharvan with the precision of someone who had spent centuries learning exactly how much weight a word could carry before it collapsed under its own significance. Caius followed as best he could, choler working at its limits, flagging emotional sub-frequencies that told him as much as the words did. The way her harmonics shifted when she addressed the Tharvan representative directly, an accommodation in frequency that he recognized as deliberate accessibility, the Veilthari equivalent of leaning forward to be heard. The way the room's emotional atmosphere changed in response, the Solveth reforming into shapes his training read as reassessment, the Dravani's pheromone signature shifting from its baseline caution toward something warmer. She was extraordinarily good at this. He had known that from the briefings. Watching it in person was different. The briefings described her skill as political. What he was observing was something more fundamental than politics. It was the ability to make each entity in a room feel that they had been genuinely heard, not processed, not managed, but actually received. It was rarer than any of her territorial holdings. The dispute was resolved in 40 minutes. Both parties accepted the outcome without the elaborate face-saving rituals that usually accompanied convocation decisions. The Tharvan representative's bioluminescent patterns shifted into a sequence Caius had tentatively catalogued as relief. He wrote in his notebook, "She listens the way translators listen, not for what is said, for what is meant beneath it." Then he paused and added, "I think that is why she brought me to that room, not to test whether I could read Old Veilthari, to see whether I listened the same way." He stared at the sentence for a moment. Then he looked up and across the hall and found that the Empress was already looking at him. All 6 eyes, that complete and unsettling focus, across the full width of the convocation hall. His collar caught a fragment of what she said to the court official beside her. Confidence rating 39%, barely usable, but clear enough. Bring him to the evening session. Seat him with the delegation observers, not behind them. Caius closed his notebook. The day was not over. The evening session began differently than the afternoon one. Where the afternoon had been procedural, the careful machinery of coalition maintenance, disputes resolved and alliances quietly reinforced, the evening session carried a different atmospheric weight. Caius felt it the moment he was escorted to the observer seating, which was, as the Empress had apparently instructed, positioned among the delegation observers rather than behind them. A small geographic distinction, a significant symbolic one. The Drevani ambassador's pheromone signature shifted when Caius sat down. A brief burst his equipment translated as noted. The Solvith nearest him reformed slightly in his direction, not enough to be overt, enough to be deliberate. Ambassador Reyes, seated 2 positions away in the observer section, caught his eye and gave him a look that communicated several complete sentences without words. He gave her a small nod that he hoped communicated, "I am aware this is unusual, and I am handling it carefully," and suspected communicated something more like, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm committed now." The evening session opened with something called the Honoring of Record. His briefing materials had described it briefly, a ceremonial tradition in which the Empress formally acknowledged contributions to coalition history, usually delivered in dense, formal veil thari that required 2 layers of translation to pass. He had attended the previous evening's session from the back of the hall and absorbed approximately 30% of it through his struggling collar. Tonight he was close enough to catch the emotional sub-frequencies directly, and the difference was significant. The Empress stood at the elevated platform, and the hall arranged itself into the particular quality of attention that she generated simply by being in a room. She spoke 3 acknowledgements in the traditional form, her harmonics calibrated for the ceremonial register, formal, resonant, carrying the weight of practiced repetition. The delegations received them with the practiced responses of people who knew their parts in a script they'd performed many times before. Then she paused. The pause was long enough to be noticed. Caius watched the room recalibrate in real time, the subtle adjustments of beings who had expected a 4th ceremonial acknowledgement and instead received a gap where one should have been. His collar caught the shift in ambient frequency before his eyes registered it visually. Something was changing. The Empress looked at him. "There is a tradition in the honoring of record," she said, and her harmonics had shifted out of the ceremonial register into something more direct, more personal, more present, of acknowledging what has contributed to genuine understanding. Not alliance, not trade, understanding. She paused again, and Caius had the distinct sensation of standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. 4 days ago, Earth's delegation was granted observer status at this convocation. Observer status, as it has historically been applied, means presence without participation, visibility without voice. The hall was very quiet. "This afternoon," the Empress continued, "I learned something that I did not know. Not a political calculation, not a strategic advantage, something true." Her 6 eyes remained on him with that full focus attention that he was beginning to understand was its own form of language. The inscription chamber on the northern face of this palace has been in this mountain for longer than the current empire has existed. Our scholars have attempted translation 3 times across 3 centuries and concluded each time that the archaic script had degraded beyond reliable meaning. Earth's observer representative translated it this afternoon in approximately 20 minutes, using a pre-reform reference text that our own academic institutions discarded 400 years ago. He heard Ambassador Reyes exhale softly beside him. The Empress's harmonics shifted again into a register his collar couldn't categorize. Not ceremonial, not diplomatic, not the careful, calibrated frequency of someone managing a room. Something underneath all of those, something he hadn't heard from her before. "The inscription says," she continued, and the hall was so silent that Caius could hear the subsonic hum of the transparent floor far below, "that we have been searching in the wrong direction, that the answer was never in expansion. It was in what we failed to carry with us." She let the words settle. That inscription was written by the founders of what became this empire. It was written as a warning to the civilization that would follow them, to us. And we have been walking past it for 4,000 years without being able to read it. Caius became aware that his hands were very still on his notebook. He wasn't writing. He couldn't remember deciding to stop. "I am acknowledging this," the Empress said, "because the honoring of record exists to mark genuine contributions to understanding, and because I find that I am in the position of having dismissed a species for 4 days that was, during those 4 days, paying closer attention to this coalition than most of its members. Her harmonics held steady, but underneath them his collar was catching something that registered at confidence rating 71%, the highest rating he'd gotten from her sub-frequencies all day. 71% confidence that what he was hearing beneath her words was something his translation equipment rendered as, "This costs me something, and I am choosing to pay it." The Drivani ambassador's pheromone cloud shifted into a signature Caius hadn't seen before. New data point. He filed it automatically, the habit persisting even through whatever was happening to his chest. The Empress spoke his name, his actual name, in the correct pronunciation, which required a lip configuration that Veilthari physiology didn't naturally produce and which she had clearly practiced. Caius Morrow. Earth's delegation is formally invited to participate in the remainder of this convocation, not as observers, as delegates. The silence that followed had a texture. He could feel it against his skin. Somewhere behind him, someone in the Solvith delegation reshaped into a form that his peripheral training registered as the liquid equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. The Mirathi shells produced a harmonic that his collar translated as unprecedented. The Drivani ambassador released a pheromone burst that was short, controlled, and which Caius read as, "I knew something was shifting. I did not predict this specific form." Ambassador Reyes touched his arm once briefly. He understood the message. Say something, but carefully. Caius stood. He was aware of every eye in the room. The full weight of it was considerable, not just the political weight, which was already substantial, but the personal weight of standing up in a room full of beings who had looked through him for 4 days, and speaking into the quality of attention that had replaced that invisibility. His collar was humming. His wrist display was logging. His third notebook was open on the table in front of him, and he didn't look at it. He thought about the inscription chamber, the careful depth of those ancient carved symbols, the hands that had worked slowly, deliberately, leaving something behind for whoever came after. He thought about the pre-reform reference text in the collection of a xenolinguistics professor whose family had nearly discarded it. He thought about his mother's comment about the accounting career and decided that this was probably sufficient evidence against that particular alternative path. "Thank you, Your Eminence," he said. His collar carried it clean, no double pulse, no processing lag. "Earth accepts." He sat back down. The hall breathed again around him, sound and movement, and the complex chemistry of hundreds of beings recalibrating their understanding of what was happening in this room. He picked up his notebook. He had not stopped being an observer. He understood that regardless of the formal designation change, observation was not a status. It was a practice. It was what you did when you genuinely wanted to understand something, rather than simply use it. But he wrote one thing and underlined it. There is a difference between being unseen and being unready. For 4 days I thought I was the former. I was the latter. And so were they. He looked up from the page and found that the Empress was no longer looking at him. She had returned her attention to the full hall, to the business of the evening session resuming around the significant thing that had just happened, managing it, as she managed everything, with the careful precision of someone who understood that even the most genuine moments existed inside a political structure that would immediately begin interpreting them. But as the session resumed and the hall's attention distributed itself across the agenda, he caught one last sub-frequency burst from her direction. His collar processed it. Confidence rating 66%. Let's see what you do with it. He turned to a fresh page in his third notebook. He intended to show her. The next 2 days remade Caius Morrow's understanding of what diplomacy actually was. Not the theoretical framework he'd built across years of academic study, though that framework survived largely intact and proved more useful than he'd expected. Not the procedural mechanics described in briefing materials, which turned out to be accurate the way a map of a city was accurate, technically correct and fundamentally insufficient for navigating the actual place. What changed was his understanding of the human element in it. Not human as in Earth species, human as in the irreducible personal dimension that existed beneath every formal structure, every protocol, every carefully maintained institutional surface, the thing that persisted when you stripped away the titles and the platforms and the elaborate choreography of power. He understood this because he watched the Empress work, and watching her work was an education in exactly that dimension. She held 3 bilateral meetings on the morning of the 5th day. Caius attended all 3 in his new capacity as participating delegate, a designation that still produced a small secondary surprise response in him every time a court official addressed him with it, like a bruise you keep forgetting and then pressing. The first meeting was with the Mirathi delegation, whose internal coalition tension he'd noted in his notebook on day 1. The second was with the Solvith, concerning transit corridor negotiations that had stalled in the previous 2 convocations. The third was with a small delegation from a species called the Ven, who occupied 2 planets in a system that 3 larger coalition members had overlapping historical claims to, and who had been attending convocations for 60 years without any of those claims being formally resolved. He sat in each meeting, translated what he could, noted what he couldn't, and paid attention to the dimension beneath the formal proceedings. The thing his notebook had been accumulating evidence of for 5 days without him having a clean name for it yet. The Mirathi internal tension resolved itself in the first meeting, not because the Empress addressed it directly, but because she created a specific kind of space in the conversation where both factions of the Mirathi delegation could acknowledge it, without either side having to be the first to name it. She did this through a question so carefully constructed that Caius spent 20 minutes afterward reconstructing its architecture in his notebook, trying to understand exactly how it had been built. It wasn't manipulation. It was closer to the opposite. It was a refusal to pretend that the unspoken thing wasn't present, combined with a structure that made acknowledging it safe for everyone simultaneously. He wrote, "Diplomacy at this level is not about what you say, it is about what you make it possible to say." The Solvith meeting was different. The transit corridor dispute was genuinely complex, overlapping territorial histories, competing economic interests, a previous agreement that both parties interpreted differently, and neither party wanted to acknowledge interpreting differently because doing so would require admitting that the agreement had never actually resolved what it claimed to resolve. The Empress spent 40 minutes doing something that Caius gradually recognized as excavation. Not argument, not negotiation in the traditional sense. She was digging through the layers of what had been said in previous convocations, finding the original moment where the ambiguity had been introduced, and holding it up to the light. At one point she paused and looked at him directly across the meeting table. "You've been tracking the historical sequence," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd apparently noticed him cross-referencing his notes with the formal session records on his wrist display. The ambiguity in the previous agreement was introduced in the 3rd session of the last convocation, Caius said carefully. The original draft used a specific term for transit access that has 2 valid interpretations in contemporary Veilthari. One interpretation is narrow, one is broad. The Solvith have been operating on the broad interpretation. The coalition record has been using the narrow one. He paused. If you look at the emotional sub-frequency logs from that session, which the court archives apparently maintain, the delegate who introduced that term was flagging high uncertainty harmonics at the moment of introduction. I think the ambiguity was accidental, not strategic. Nobody deliberately created this problem. It just never got caught. The Solvith representative reformed into a shape his training identified as surprise transitioning toward relief. The emotional signature of, "I have been arguing a case I wasn't certain of for 10 years, and you've just told me the original confusion wasn't my fault," was apparently consistent across significant physiological differences. The Empress looked at him for a moment, with an expression he was beginning to be able to read. Not the ceremonial neutrality, not the diplomatic precision, the underneath one. "Correct," she said. "I suspected this. I could not prove it without the archive cross-reference." A pause. "You did that from memory?" "And 3 notebooks," Caius said. Something shifted at the corner of her expression. He filed it. The Ven meeting was the one that stayed with him. The Ven was small, not in political significance, though that was also true, but physically small. their representatives barely reaching his shoulder, with delicate translucent structures around their heads that caught light and refracted it in patterns his collar identified as a supplementary communication channel, color and brightness modulating meaning alongside speech. They had been attending convocations for 60 years. Their territorial situation had not materially changed in that time. They had learned across those 6 decades the particular posture of beings who have been present long enough to understand that their presence is tolerated rather than valued, and who have made a kind of peace with that understanding because the alternative was not attending at all. Caius recognized the posture. He'd been practicing a version of it for 4 days. The Empress opened the meeting with the standard formal acknowledgement, and the Ven representative responded with the practiced precision of someone who had delivered the reciprocal acknowledgement many times before. Then she did something that made Caius set down his pen. She stopped the formal proceeding entirely. "I want to ask you something outside the standard agenda," she said, and her harmonics shifted into the direct personal register he'd first heard in the inscription chamber. "In 60 years of attendance, what has this coalition failed to understand about your situation that it should have understood by now?" The silence that followed was long. The Ven representative's translucent structures caught the light in a rapid shifting pattern his collar couldn't pass. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, the careful of someone who had an answer that had been waiting 60 years for someone to ask the question. "You have been treating our territorial situation as a legal problem," she said. "It is not a legal problem. Our people do not need a formal resolution of the historical claims. We need to know whether we are considered part of this coalition or a matter to be managed by it. Those are different things. We have been waiting 60 years for someone to tell us which one we are." The room was very quiet. Caius looked at the Empress. Her expression had shifted in a way he'd never seen from her across 5 days of observation. Not the careful diplomatic neutrality, not the ceremonial formal register, not even the direct personal underneath tone he'd come to recognize. Something deeper than all of those. Something that looked, in the specific quality of stillness it produced in her face, like the particular weight of genuine recognition. Of seeing something clearly that you had not seen clearly before, and understanding what that failure of sight had cost. Her harmonics, when she spoke, were the lowest he'd heard from her. Not quiet, low. The register that his training associated with sincerity stripped of performance. "You are part of this coalition," she said. "That should have been said 60 years ago. I am saying it now and acknowledging that the delay was a failure of this institution, not a reflection of your worth within it." The Ven representative's translucent structures flooded with light. His collar couldn't translate the pattern. He didn't need it to. Afterward, walking back through the corridor toward the main hall, the Empress was quiet for long enough that Caius stopped trying to fill the silence. He had learned across 5 days that her silences were not empty. They were occupied. They were where she went to process things she hadn't finished processing. When she spoke, she didn't look at him. She looked at the corridor wall, the undecorated mountain rock, the palace that had stood above a dead ocean for longer than her empire had existed. "I have conducted approximately 4,000 formal diplomatic meetings in my life," she said. "I have been asking the wrong questions in a significant portion of them." A pause. "You asked me in the inscription chamber why you came here, why you were really here." She stopped walking, turned to face him, all 6 eyes, that complete focus, but the expression behind them was different from anything he'd catalogued. "Why did you not tell me then that you came because you believed something true about what this kind of work could be, and had spent 4 days watching it fall short of that belief?" Caius considered the question honestly. "Because I'd only just met you," he said, "and that kind of truth requires some trust first." Her expression did something he had no entry for in any of his notebooks. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." They stood in the corridor for a moment that had a particular quality. The quality of 2 people who have, through a combination of accident and attention and the specific willingness to be honest, arrived somewhere neither of them had a map for. Then she turned and walked toward the hall, and he followed, and his collar caught one last fragment of sub-frequency that registered at confidence rating 81%. The highest rating he'd received from any source across the entire convocation. His equipment rendered it simply, cleanly, with unusual confidence. I was wrong about what mattered here, and that is worth more than being right. He didn't write it in his notebook. Some things you carry differently than notes. The final morning of the convocation arrived the way significant endings often do, quietly, without the ceremonial weight you'd expect from something that had shifted the shape of things. Caius woke early, before the palace's atmospheric systems had cycled into their daytime composition, when the transparent floor sections still showed the dead ocean below in the blue-grey half-light of Vaelthar's pre-dawn. He sat at the small desk in his quarters that had been upgraded on the 5th day from the functional closet of his first 4 days to something with an actual window, an upgrade that Ambassador Reyes had noted with the expression of someone cataloguing evidence, and looked at his 3 notebooks arranged side by side on the desk surface. 3 notebooks in 7 days. He'd never filled 3 notebooks in a week before. He'd never had a week that warranted it. He opened the 3rd one to the last written page and read back through the final entries. The Ven representative's translucent structures flooding with light, the Empress's harmonics in the corridor, the 81% confidence reading, the sentence his collar had rendered with unusual clarity. The look on her face in the inscription chamber when she'd understood that the ancient warning carved into her palace wall had been legible the entire time, waiting for someone to look at it with the right reference frame. He read all of it, and then he closed the notebook and sat with the accumulated weight of the week. His translation collar was on the desk beside the notebooks, charging. Without it on his throat, the room was a particular kind of quiet. His own quiet, unmediated by the constant low hum of processing. He sat in it for a while and let himself feel the fullness of what the week had been, without immediately converting it into analysis. He thought about the 14-hour drive to buy a dead professor's archive from a family who didn't know what they had. He thought about 3 years of self-teaching from incomplete and contradictory reference texts, building a framework for understanding something ancient that no one around him considered relevant. He thought about his mother's comment about accounting and allowed himself, privately, a moment of simple satisfaction that was not complicated by anything else. Then he picked up his collar, put it back on, and went to pack. The closing ceremony was held in the Convocation Hall, which had been reconfigured overnight. The ceiling's carved rock surface had been augmented with projection elements that displayed the coalition's star systems in their actual spatial relationships, each one pulsing softly with light, a map of everything the convocation existed to maintain. Caius stood in his designated position, delegate section, not observer section, still producing that small secondary surprise response, and looked up at the map and tried to find Earth's system in it. He couldn't. It was there. The briefing materials confirmed it was included, but at this scale it was simply one point of light among thousands, unremarkable in position, carrying no particular visual weight. He found that he was all right with that. Ambassador Reyes appeared beside him, carrying herself with the specific quality of someone who had reassessed a situation and was still in the process of updating their internal model. She'd been doing that since the evening of the 5th day, with increasing frequency and decreasing attempts to conceal it. 17 meeting requests, she said quietly. Final count, across both days of full delegation status. I know. The Drevani want a cultural exchange program. The Mirathi have proposed a joint xenolinguistic research initiative. The Ven representative asked specifically for your contact credentials, which is the first time in 60 years their delegation has made a direct outreach request to any non-coalition species. She paused. The Solvith Transit Corridor resolution is going into the formal record as resolved pending Earth's review of the archive cross-reference, which means your notebook analysis will be cited in a coalition legal document. I know, Caius said again. He looked at the star map overhead. Is there anything else? The Vaelthari Court has submitted a formal request to Earth's academic institutions for access to the pre-reform xenolinguistic archive collection. They want to digitize and restore it. Full institutional credit to the original collector. She said this in a tone of someone delivering information they were still processing. The professor whose family almost discarded it. She'll be cited in Veilthari academic records. Caius was quiet for a moment. He thought about 40 years of collecting, a career spent pursuing something that no one around you considered relevant, the particular faith required to believe that things which were lost were not necessarily gone. He thought about a family that hadn't known what they had, and a 14-hour drive, and a reference text missing several pages that had turned out to contain exactly what was needed anyway. "Good," he said. It came out simply, without the weight of anything more complicated. Just good. The ceremony began. The 12 delegations took their formal positions, the elaborate choreography of a closing that had been conducted in the same basic structure for as long as the convocation had existed. Speeches were delivered in the traditional form, acknowledgements exchanged, the formal record sealed with the ceremonial frequency broadcast that his collar rendered as the Veilthari equivalent of a notarized signature. He watched all of it with the attention he'd brought to everything this week. Not detached observation, but genuine presence. The practice of actually being where you were. The Empress spoke last. Her closing address was traditionally the formal summary of the convocation's outcomes. Resolutions reached, alliances reaffirmed, the institutional language of continuity that held a coalition of 12 species together across the vast distances that would separate them once this palace descended to Veilthar's surface and everyone scattered back to their respective corners of the galaxy. She delivered the first portion in that form, with the precision and resonance of someone who had given this address many times and understood exactly what it needed to carry. Then she paused, in the same way she had paused in the honoring of record 2 days before. "There is a line in the inscription chamber of this palace," she said, and the hall attended to her with its full quality of silence. "Written 4,000 years ago by the founders of this empire. It says that we have been searching in the wrong direction, that the answer was never in our expansion. It was in what we failed to carry with us." She let the words settle. "I have walked past that inscription for 2 centuries. I could not read it. I believed I could not read it because it was too old, too degraded, too far from anything the present moment required." A pause that held weight. "I was wrong. The inscription was legible. I simply did not have the right reference frame." The hall was very quiet. "What I failed to carry," she continued, "was the understanding that legibility requires humility, that the thing you cannot read is not necessarily unreadable, that the species you have not listened to is not necessarily without something worth hearing." Her harmonics held steady in that register he'd come to recognize, the underneath one, the one that cost something to sustain. Earth's delegation came to this convocation as observers. They leave as delegates. That change in designation reflects a change in my understanding, not a change in what Earth is or was. What Earth was, on the first day of this convocation, was exactly what it is today. We simply failed to look at it with the right reference frame. Caius looked at his hands on the desk in front of him, then at his 3 notebooks, then at the star map overhead, where Earth's system pulsed with the same quiet light as the thousands of others around it. He thought about something the Empress had said in the corridor outside the Venn meeting, about asking the wrong questions in a significant portion of 4,000 diplomatic meetings, and what it felt like to recognize that clearly. He thought about her face in that moment, not the ceremonial neutrality, not the diplomatic precision, but the underneath expression, the one that looked like the specific weight of genuine recognition. He thought about how that recognition had moved across her face, and the quality of stillness it had produced, and how his collar had caught the sub-frequency beneath it at 81% confidence, the clearest reading he'd gotten all week, and rendered it with unusual simplicity. "I was wrong about what mattered here, and that is worth more than being right." He had not written it in his notebook. He'd said he carried some things differently than notes. He carried this one as the understanding that the most significant thing he'd witnessed all week had not been the translation, or the meeting requests, or the formal designation change, or even the Venn representative's translucent structures flooding with light. It had been an empress who had ruled 47 star systems for 2 centuries, who had prevented wars and forged alliances and shaped the fates of civilizations, choosing to say clearly and publicly that she had been wrong. Not because it was politically advantageous, not because it served a strategic purpose, but because truth, offered genuinely without calculation, was the rarest resource in the galaxy. And she had recognized it when she saw it, and had chosen to offer it back. The ceremony closed. The formal frequency broadcast sealed the record. Around him, delegations began the careful process of farewell, the elaborate choreography of endings that mirrored the choreography of beginnings, familiar enough to feel like continuity. The Empress descended from the platform and moved through the hall, exchanging the formal farewells with the precision of long practice. When she reached the Earth delegation, she stopped. She looked at him with all 6 eyes. That complete, focused attention he now understood was its own form of respect. And she said something that his collar translated cleanly. No processing lag. Confidence rating 93%. "Show me the truth," she said. "That was what I demanded of you, though I did not know I was asking it." A pause. "You did." Caius thought about all the answers he could give. The careful diplomatic ones, the formally appropriate ones, the ones that acknowledged the weight of what she'd said without pushing back on any of it. "You showed it back," he said. "That was the harder part." Her expression did the thing he still didn't have a notebook entry for, the one that had appeared first in the corridor outside the Venn meeting, and that he'd been trying to categorize ever since. He understood it now, standing in the closing moments of the convocation, with the star map overhead and his 3 notebooks in his bag, and the pre-reform archive somewhere in a digitization queue that would eventually restore 40 years of a dead professor's work to the record. It was the expression of someone who had been genuinely met, not managed, not impressed, not strategically engaged. Met. The expression that appeared when the distance between 2 people, however vast, however different the shapes of their lives and the scales of their power, collapsed into the simple fact of actual contact. She inclined her head, a small gesture, unelaborate. He returned it. Then the farewell choreography continued around them, and the hall moved toward its closing, and the palace began its slow descent toward Veilthar's surface, and the Convocation of 12 Weights ended the way it had every decade for as long as anyone could remember. Except that this time the record it left behind was different. Not because Earth had been elevated, not because an empress had been corrected, but because somewhere in the intersection of an ancient inscription and a dead professor's archive, and 3 notebooks filled by a man from a backwater planet who had decided that the things other people considered irrelevant were worth a 14-hour drive. Somewhere in that intersection, 2 beings from opposite ends of everything had looked at each other with the right reference frame and found each other legible. Outside the palace windows, Veilthar's surface rose slowly toward them, solid ground after days suspended in the sky. Caius watched it come. His collar hummed softly. His wrist display logged the descent rate. His 3rd notebook sat in his bag, full. He was already thinking about the 4th one. If this story made you stop and think about the things we dismiss too quickly, the people we look past, the truths that wait patiently for the right reference frame, then you already understand why these stories matter. HFY Soundscape exists for exactly this. The quiet, stubborn belief that genuine connection across impossible distances is not just possible, but necessary. Subscribe if that belief feels like yours too. The next story is already waiting.